Berserkers were absolute wild men in battle.
The Berserkers were those troops that were sent out.
The Berserkers are supposed to be extinct, a vanished cult of foaming, drug-fueled Viking warriors, gone with the end of the Viking Age, surviving only in saga and legend. They are not extinct. The drink that produced them was just identified. Not the mushroom the textbooks have repeated for 2 centuries, but a brew prepared by a woman buried at Fyrkat in 980 AD with hundreds of seeds in a leather pouch.
The Vikings actually knew, of course, what they were doing when they went out on these raids.
And the men who drank it are still here. Their genes are walking modern Norway right now, in valleys their ancestors raided from. The warriors, the sagas refused to let die. Somewhere on a battlefield in 9th century England, a small group of men stands apart from the rest of the line. They are not armored. Some are stripped to the waist in defiance of the cold. Others wear pelts. They are shaking, foaming, biting the rims of their shields. When the line breaks into a charge, these men go first, and the men who go second are afraid of them. There is no ordinary weapon for what is about to happen. There is no ordinary explanation for it either. The line moves, and the foaming men are already deeper into the enemy formation than they should be, taking blows that ought to drop them and not dropping. Hours later, when the field is still, those who survive will collapse where they stand and not move for days. The texts called them Berserkers.
And taken back to Norway, which is where this particular bunch came from.
The rage warriors of Norse tradition. Said to feel no pain and no fear, the sagas describe them with a precision that does not look invented. Snorri Sturluson, writing in the early 13th century, says they fought without armor, were as strong as bears or wild bulls, killed men with single blows, and could not be harmed by fire or iron. The Ynglinga saga puts it that flatly. The Haraldskvedi, a 9th century skaldic poem composed in honor of King Harald Fairhair of Norway, places them at the inner circle of his household and describes them howling like animals as they advanced. Egil's saga goes further. The grandfather of its protagonist becomes a berserker by night, and his own household will not approach him. The word itself is contested. Berserker in Old Norse is a compound. Serker means shirt or coat. The first element has 2 readings. It may mean bear, a warrior in a bearskin garment, or it may mean bear, a warrior fighting without a shirt at all. The saga record supports both. Some berserkers wore pelts, others stripped down in the snow. What the word does not describe is a casual category. The berserker had a function, and the function was understood across the Viking world. Kings used them as personal guards. Raiders used them as shock troops. They went first into the shield wall, and the shield wall broke. Their service was sought across Scandinavia, from Norwegian fjord chieftains to the kings of the British Isles to the war bands that traveled the eastern river systems of what is now Russia. But the same texts that praise them describe them as dangerous to live near. They attacked their neighbors during fits of rage. Several saga episodes record berserkers being hunted down and executed in peacetime by ordinary farmers acting in self-defense. They were frequently killed by their own communities once their usefulness in war had ended. They were a weapon, and a weapon their own people did not entirely trust. The phenomenon is concentrated in the period from roughly the 8th through the 11th centuries, with its densest documentation in Norway and Sweden, and battlefield records stretching across the entire Viking diaspora. After Christianization in the 11th and 12th centuries, the figure disappears. Icelandic law codes from the period explicitly outlaw the practice. Whatever institution had produced the berserker was dismantled within a few generations, and the figure passed from active warrior into legend. The saga descriptions are too consistent across separate texts and too physiologically specific to be invention. The shaking, the foaming, the apparent immunity to wounds, the collapse and prolonged exhaustion that followed combat. These are not flourishes. They describe a physical state that something was inducing in a specific category of men, on demand, before battle. Something pharmacological was happening. For 1,000 years, the question was, what? The leather pouch at Fyrkat. In 1977, Danish archaeologists were excavating a Viking-era cemetery at Fyrkat, a fortified ring-shaped stronghold built during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century. They opened a grave that did not match the others. It belonged to a woman, dated to roughly 980 AD. The goods buried, with her marked her as a person of unusual status. She had been laid in a wagon body, a treatment reserved for the highest-ranking individuals. She wore silver toe rings. Nothing else like them has been found in the Scandinavian record. Beside her lay a bronze bowl from Central Asia, a continent away from where she died. A metal wand of the kind associated in saga literature with ritual specialists, amulets, animal bones, and, set close to the body, a small leather pouch. The pouch was unremarkable, the size of a clenched fist, cracked, darkened, fragile. The kind of object a careless excavation could have crushed without anyone noticing. The Fyrkat team did not crush it. They lifted it, opened it, and counted what was inside. The pouch held hundreds of seeds. When the seeds were sent for identification, they came back as Hyoscyamus niger, black henbane, Northern Europe's most powerful native hallucinogen, a plant whose alkaloids can stop a human heart at a dose smaller than the contents of that pouch. This is where the textbook story breaks. Henbane seeds in a sealed leather pouch buried with a ritual specialist are not a personal stash. They are raw material. And raw material has to be processed before it does anything useful. Eating the seeds whole produces unstable, dangerous, sometimes fatal results, because the active alkaloids are unevenly distributed and slowly released. One seed is barely psychoactive. A small handful kills. There is no margin in chewing them. To produce the effects the sagas describe, the seeds have to be brewed, crushed, infused into liquid, often combined with fat or alcohol to extract the alkaloids efficiently. The pharmacology demands it. A brewed infusion is dose-controlled. The brewer can taste it, dilute it, hold it at the threshold she wants. A chewed seed is a coin flip. The seeds were not the product. They were the ingredient. The product was a drink, a brew that someone with training could measure, time, and hand to a man who needed to walk into a battle and not feel what was about to happen to him. The bronze bowl was not decorative. The wand was not a status symbol alone. The pouch, the vessel, the implements, the woman buried with all of them. These are the components of a preparation kit. Most researchers now identify the Fyrkat woman as a vulva, a Norse seeress, a category of ritual specialist documented in the Eddic poetry as women who traveled between communities, performed ceremonies, interpreted visions, and administered substances that altered the mental states of those who consumed them. She was not a warrior. She was the warrior's pharmacist. If reopened cases like this one are why you're here, hit subscribe and turn the bell on. The next chapter is where the toxicology starts to make the woman in the grave terrifying. The Fyrkat burial was not a one-off. Subsequent excavations across Scandinavia have produced henbane seeds in contexts associated with warrior burials, ritual deposits, and high-status graves dating across the Viking Age. The plant was being grown, harvested, and curated within Norse society, generation after generation. The contexts are consistently ritual, never domestic. This was not a kitchen herb. It was a controlled substance handled by specialists, delivered by drink, and the women who handled it traveled between communities with the same reputation a controlled substance handler carries in any society: feared, needed, never quite trusted. And the symptoms a brewed henbane infusion produces in a human body match the saga record line for line. Henbane's active compounds are hyoscyamine and scopolamine, tropane alkaloids, the same chemical family that produces the effects of belladonna and datura. The clinical literature on henbane intoxication is extensive because people still die from it. The symptom profile is documented in modern toxicology cases. Emergency rooms in Northern Europe still receive patients every year who have eaten the wrong plant in the wrong dose. And the clinical picture is consistent. It produces severe agitation. Not sedation, agitation, hyperactivity, a racing heart and flushed hot skin. It produces vivid hallucinations, often violent or paranoid, in which the user perceives threats that are not there and acts on them. It produces dramatic dissociation from pain, one of its most consistent reported effects in poisoning cases. Patients in this state have been known to walk on broken bones without registering them. It produces a distinctive symptom that appears repeatedly in saga descriptions of berserkers entering their state, foaming at the mouth, caused by suppression of the body's normal swallow reflex by scopolamine. Saliva pools, the mouth cannot clear it. And in the recovery phase, henbane produces profound, prolonged exhaustion that can last for days. Egil's saga describes a berserker named Ljot entering a state in which he howled and bit his shield, and being incapacitated for days afterward. The clinical literature describes that exact profile. The fit is item by item: agitation, pain, immunity, foaming, multi-day collapse. The berserker in the saga record and the henbane patient in the modern toxicology ward are the same physiological event, separated by 1,000 years. The pharmacological question had its answer. The drink was henbane. The Fyrkat woman, or someone like her, brewed it, and the man who drank it became, briefly, the thing the sagas described. The mushroom answer was wrong for 200 years. To understand why the henbane finding is a correction and not a discovery, you have to understand what it replaced. The mushroom theory came from a single 18th century Swedish theologian. His name was Samuel Ödman. In 1784, he published a short paper proposing that the berserker rage was caused by Amanita muscaria, the red and white fly agaric, the toadstool of folklore. He had never tested the mushroom on a human. He had never examined a Viking-era skeletal remain. He had no chemistry. He had no archaeology. What he had was a literary argument. His reasoning ran along two lines. The first was geographic. Indigenous peoples of Siberia, Koryak, Chukchi, Sami, used Amanita muscaria for shamanic trance. Ödman drew a line across the map from Siberia to Scandinavia and proposed that knowledge of the mushroom's effects had traveled west into the Viking world. The second was symptomatic. He had read accounts describing Siberian users as dissociated, agitated, distorted in perception. He matched them against the saga record and concluded the fit was close enough to publish. The theory was elegant: a red mushroom, a warrior cult, a transformation. Easy to remember, easy to illustrate. And for 2 centuries, it was repeated. Encyclopedias, histories, textbooks, documentaries, fantasy novels, video games. Every modern depiction of a berserker chewing a mushroom traces back to one Swedish theologian who reasoned by analogy from a culture 2,000 miles east of Norway and never tested his own claim. The illustration of the warrior with a fly agaric in his hand became so common it began to feel like evidence in itself, simply through repetition. It survived because nothing tested it. Through the 19th century and most of the 20th, the tools to test pharmacological claims about historical populations did not exist. No chemical residue analysis, no forensic toxicology, no archaeobotany at burial context resolution. A guess from 1784 held its ground simply by being there first, citation after citation, generation after generation, until questioning it felt like questioning the Vikings themselves. Then the chemistry arrived. When researchers compiled the modern clinical literature on Amanita muscaria, the answer was the opposite of what Ödman had assumed. The active compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, are sedatives. They produce nausea, vomiting, profuse sweating, ataxia, the loss of muscle coordination, confusion, slurred speech, in significant doses, unconsciousness. The mushroom is a depressant. A man who ate enough fly agaric to alter his mental state would be more likely to vomit on himself and fall asleep than to charge a shield wall. The Siberian comparison broke down too. The ethnographic record shows Koryak, Chukchi, and Sami users consuming the mushroom in stillness, lying down while attendants watched their bodies for hours. They did not pick up axes afterward. The cultural function of Amanita was the opposite of what the berserker hypothesis required. Mushrooms produced sedation. Henbane produced agitation. Mushrooms produced nausea and stillness. Henbane produced violent activity and pain immunity. Mushrooms had no documented combat tradition anywhere on Earth. Henbane was buried in a leather pouch with a woman who appears to have been a warrior's pharmacist. The fight was not close. The mushroom theory had been a guess. The henbane finding is evidence: physical, archaeological, pharmacological, and cumulative. The men were Norwegian. Once the drug was settled, the question shifted to the men. For most of the modern era, the berserkers had been treated as a category apart. A persistent strand of 19th and early 20th century scholarship suggested they were a distinct ethnic or tribal lineage, a separate population, perhaps a substrate of older northern European inhabitants. perhaps imported through Viking trade networks, but in any case biologically distinguishable from ordinary farmers and fishermen. The Berserker in this reading was not just culturally different, he was genetically other. That theory was built without the evidence required to test it. When the evidence arrived, it did not survive. Through the 2000s and 10s, ancient DNA analysis on Viking Age skeletal remains accelerated dramatically. The work culminated in a landmark study published in 2020 by an international team led by researchers at the University of Copenhagen. They sequenced the genomes of more than 400 individuals from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora: Norway, Sweden, the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, the eastern river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The study reshaped what was known about Norse genetic identity. The Vikings were not a uniform Scandinavian population. The genetic record showed significant gene flow from southern Europe, the British Isles, and the Asian steppe across the Viking Age. A heterogeneous society in which individuals of widely differing ancestries lived, fought, and were buried alongside one another. Within that picture, researchers examined specific high-status warrior burials at higher resolution than had ever been possible. Skeletal remains identified through grave goods, burial position, and skeletal trauma patterns as belonging to elite warriors, including burials interpreted as berserkers or members of comparable warrior cohorts, were sequenced and compared against the broader Norse genetic distribution. The trauma patterns alone tell their own story. Skulls split by axes, forearms broken in the defensive position of a man trying to ward off a downward blow, healed wounds on top of healed wounds, showing men who had been damaged in combat, recovered, and gone back. These were not ceremonial graves. The bones recorded the lives of men who had spent years inside violence, and their DNA showed nothing the older theories had predicted. They were not outliers. They were not concentrated in any unusual ancestry cluster. They did not carry markers indicating descent from a separate population. They sat squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of Viking Age Norway and Sweden, indistinguishable at the level of ancestry from the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen buried in nearby graves. The Berserker was not a foreign tribe. He was not a vanished bloodline. He was a local Norwegian man, drawn from the same population that worked the fjords and farmed the inland valleys. The man who foamed at the mouth before the shield wall and the man who pulled cod out of a fjord on the same morning were, at the level of blood, the same kind of man. What set him apart from his neighbors was not his blood. It was the institution that had claimed him. The capacity to enter the Berserker state was not in the genes. It was in the system that selected him, trained him, brewed the henbane, administered the drink, managed the recovery, and deployed him on command. The Berserker in this reading was not a creature. He was a product. A production line ran through specialists like the Fyrkat woman, who grew the plant, prepared the brew, and delivered it to men whose ancestors had farmed the same valleys for generations. That production line was not casual. Henbane is not a plant. A community grows by accident. It has to be cultivated. Harvested at the right time, dried, stored, kept away from livestock and children. Someone has to know how much to use, how to extract the alkaloids, how to dose a body of a particular size. Someone has to know how to bring a man back afterward, how to feed him, hydrate him, watch him through the days when his heart is still racing and his sleep is still broken. The whole infrastructure of producing a berserker was a craft, held by women, passed from one practitioner to the next, embedded in a social and ritual structure that the rest of the community supported and feared in equal measure. When the institution ended, the production line ended, but the men did not. The genes in the valleys. This is the part the title promises, and it is the part that is hardest to absorb without losing the science. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Scandinavians, drawing on tens of thousands of sequenced genomes from Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic biobanks, have established direct continuity between the Viking Age population and the modern Scandinavian one. The genetic distance between a 10th century Norwegian warrior and a 21st century Norwegian farmer is, in most cases, statistically negligible. They are the same people, separated only by time. The same Y chromosome haplogroups documented in Viking-era warrior burials, including burials interpreted as belonging to berserker cohorts, are present at high frequencies in modern Norwegian men today. The Y chromosome is the genetic marker that passes only from father to son, intact, generation after generation. It is the line a male descendant carries from his earliest male ancestor. And the Y chromosome lines found in the bones of men who fought in Viking shield walls are still being passed down today, in the same regions, by men whose families have not moved. Specific lineages traced through ancient DNA have been matched to living descendants in the same valleys where the original burials were excavated. In some cases, geneticists have been able to draw a line from a specific 10th century skeleton to a present-day man living within walking distance of where that skeleton was buried. Not a vague ancestral relationship, a traceable, documented descent. The Berserkers, as genetic individuals, did not disappear with the Christianization of Scandinavia. The institution that produced them disappeared. The ritual specialists who controlled the henbane disappeared. The pharmacological pipeline that converted ordinary men into the warrior state was dismantled within a few generations of the conversion, and Icelandic law codes from the period explicitly outlawed the practice of going berserker. The drink stopped being brewed. The women who brewed it stopped training successors. The knowledge died with them. The men themselves did not vanish. They fathered children before the institution ended and during the centuries it operated. Those children fathered children. The chain has not been broken in the 1,000 years since the last documented berserker laid down his axe. The contrast with the cultural memory of the berserker is the strangest part of all this. In popular history, in fantasy literature, in film and television, the berserker is treated as an extinct archetype, a creature of saga and legend, gone with the Viking Age. The figure has the same narrative shape as the Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean, a people whose disappearance is the central fact of the story. The DNA tells a different story. The disappearance never happened. What ended was not a population. It was a practice. The point is not that modern Norwegians carry a hereditary capacity for rage. They do not. The Berserker gang was a cultural and pharmacological phenomenon. It required the plant, the specialist, the ritual context, and the social institution that organized all three. None of those things are encoded in DNA. What is encoded is ancestry, a record of who fathered whom, not of what they did for a living. The Berserker bloodline is not a monster's bloodline. It is a Norwegian one. The men who returned from raids and lived past the typical lifespan of a warrior in that role settled into the same villages and farmed the same valleys as everyone else. They married, they had children. The genetic signal of their lineages flowed back into the population pool from which they had been recruited. The men buried at Fyrkat and the other sites where the henbane and the warrior remains have been found are, in genetic terms, the direct ancestors of the population that lives in modern Norway today. There is no separate Berserker descent line that survived alongside the mainstream. There is only the mainstream itself, which absorbed them. Picture a farmer in a valley in western Norway this morning. His grandfather knew the name of the farm. His great-grandfather knew the name of the farm. The valley has had the same name for 1,000 years. The river running through it has been crossed by his family for longer than any record can prove. Somewhere on the wall of his house, there may be a photograph of a man in a hat from 1910. A name, a date, a face he half recognizes from the mirror. Beyond that, the line goes dark. He does not know who his great-great-great-grandfather was. He does not know what his great-great-great-great-grandfather did for a living. He does not know what was in his bloodstream the day he died. Somewhere along that line, in a generation no one in the family remembers, a man drank from a brewed cup handed to him by a woman who knew exactly how much henbane was in it. He went into a battle stripped to the waist. He came out of it shaking. He was incapacitated for days. Someone fed him. Someone watched over him. He recovered. He had children. Those children had children. The chain ran through 1,200 years of Norwegian winters and arrived at the man in the valley. He does not know. There is no way for him to know. The institution that would have made him a berserker has been gone for 1,000 years. The seeress who would have brewed his drink is in the ground at Fyrkat. The leather pouch is in a museum. The skill of producing the warrior state on demand died with the women who held it. But the bloodline is not gone. It is just on a tractor. It is in a fishing boat off the Lofoten coast. It is in a school in Trondheim. It is at a kitchen table in a valley in Hordaland, eating breakfast, opening a newspaper, completely unaware. There are men in Norway right now whose direct ancestor in the male line went into a 9th century shield wall foaming at the mouth, and they will live and die without knowing it. The men did not vanish. The thing that made them vanished. Everything else is still here. Which detail moved your picture of the Berserker the most? The leather pouch at Fyrkat, the woman who brewed the drink, or the men still walking the same valleys their ancestors raided from? Drop it in the comments. If reopened cases like this one pull you in, subscribe. The next investigation is already in production, and the evidence in that one is even stranger.